The relationship between the United States and China stands as one of the world's most consequential bilateral partnerships in the 21st century. The two nations combined represent more than one-third of global gross domestic product and are the primary drivers of international trade, technology innovation, and geopolitical stability. Their interactions, or tensions, reverberate across markets, supply chains, and security arrangements worldwide. For nearly three-quarters of a century, U.S. China relations have oscillated between episodes of profound estrangement and periods of strategic cooperation. What began as a relationship rooted in ideological opposition and military hostility has evolved into one characterized by economic interdependence, technological competition, and strategic rivalry. Understanding the trajectory of this relationship, from Cold War isolation to 21st century complexity, is essential to comprehending contemporary global affairs. The bilateral relationship encompasses multiple dimensions: economic trade valued at over $600 billion annually, technological competition in artificial intelligence and semiconductors, military posturing in the Indo-Pacific region, and historical disputes over Taiwan and territorial claims in the South China Sea. As the world's two largest economies navigate their competing interests, the outcomes of their negotiations and disputes will determine not only their own prosperity, but also global economic stability, technological development, and the likelihood of military conflict in Asia. The history of U.S.-China relations is inseparable from the Chinese Communist Revolution that transformed the Asian geopolitical landscape in the immediate aftermath of World War II. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, PRC, after the Communist Party defeated the American-backed nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek in a protracted civil war. The defeated nationalist forces retreated to Taiwan, establishing the Republic of China, ROC, on the island. The United States refused to recognize the legitimacy of the new communist government on the mainland. Instead, Washington extended diplomatic recognition to Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan, positioning itself as a supporter of the exiled nationalist regime. This decision set the stage for more than 2 decades of mutual isolation and hostility between Washington and Beijing. The Korean War, which erupted in June 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea, crystallized the antagonism between the two nations. When United Nations forces, led by the United States, began advancing toward the Chinese border in late 1950, the Chinese government responded by sending hundreds of thousands of troops into Korea to prevent what Beijing perceived as a threat to its territorial security. The resulting conflict resulted in millions of casualties and reinforced the view in both capitals that the other represented an existential threat. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the United States pursued a policy of what scholars have termed containment with hostility toward the PRC. Washington orchestrated international efforts to isolate China diplomatically, blocked the PRC from securing a seat in the United Nations, where the Taiwan-based Republic of China held China's Permanent Security Council seat, and imposed comprehensive trade embargoes. China, meanwhile, looked primarily toward the Soviet Union for economic and military assistance, though the alliance between the two communist powers began deteriorating in the late 1950s as ideological and geopolitical differences widened. The diplomatic isolation of the People's Republic of China began to erode in the late 1960s and early 1970s, driven by shifting geopolitical calculations in both Washington and Beijing. The deterioration of Sino-Soviet relations following the 1969 border conflict between Chinese and Soviet forces created an opening that President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, sought to exploit. The first public indication of warming relations came in April 1971 through what became known as Ping-Pong diplomacy. Members of the American table tennis team competing in Japan received an unexpected invitation to visit China, making them the first Americans to visit mainland China since 1949. Though seemingly trivial, this sporting exchange represented a significant thaw in relations and signaled to observers worldwide that a shift in U.S. policy toward China was underway. Behind the scenes, Kissinger conducted secret negotiations with Chinese officials through Pakistani intermediaries. In July 1971, without prior public announcement, Kissinger traveled covertly to Beijing to prepare the groundwork for a presidential visit. On July 15, 1971, President Nixon stunned the world by announcing that he would visit China, a dramatic diplomatic reversal that shocked Cold War observers, particularly those who viewed China as an implacable communist adversary. Nixon's historic 8-day visit to China in February 1972 marked the culmination of these secret negotiations. The president met with Communist Party Chairman Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai and toured the Great Wall. The centerpiece of the visit was the Shanghai Communique, signed by Nixon and Zhou Enlai, which established a framework for U.S. China diplomatic engagement. Critically, the communique addressed the Taiwan issue, the principal obstacle to formal diplomatic relations, by stating that the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China, and that the U.S. would progressively reduce its military presence on the island. The Shanghai Communique did not immediately result in full diplomatic relations, but it set the stage for normalization. The two countries opened liaison offices in each other's capitals, a precursor to embassy-level diplomatic relations. The formal establishment of diplomatic relations occurred on January 1, 1979, under the administration of President Jimmy Carter. The United States broke its formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan and transferred diplomatic recognition to Beijing. However, the Taiwan Relations Act, passed by Congress and signed by President Carter, provided the legal framework for continued unofficial relations with Taiwan and committed the United States to providing Taiwan with military equipment necessary for its self-defense. This arrangement, which remains in effect today, represents a deliberate ambiguity that both sides have accepted. Taiwan maintains de facto independence. The U.S. remains Taiwan's de facto security guarantor, and China has refrained from attempting military reunification, though it has never renounced the possibility. Following normalization, U.S. China relations entered a phase characterized by economic engagement and strategic cooperation against the Soviet Union. China, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, initiated sweeping economic reforms beginning in 1978. The policy of reform and opening up, Gauge Kaifang, gradually transformed the Chinese economy from a centrally planned system toward a market-oriented model while maintaining Communist Party political control. The United States, recognizing the strategic value of a China aligned against Soviet expansion, supported China's integration into the international economic system. In 1986, China applied to rejoin the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, the precursor to the World Trade Organization. After decades of negotiations, China acceded to the World Trade Organization on December 11, 2001, in what represented a watershed moment in the U.S.-China relationship. China's WTO membership opened vast markets to American companies and positioned China as the world's manufacturing hub. Bilateral trade exploded. U.S. imports from China grew from approximately $100 billion in 2001 to more than $400 billion by 2023. American consumers benefited from lower prices on goods, ranging from electronics to clothing, while American companies established supply chains and manufacturing operations throughout China. This period witnessed the deepening of economic interdependence between the two nations. During the Cold War's final decade and the immediate post-Cold War years, U.S.-China relations experienced periods of both cooperation and friction. The two countries coordinated on issues including the Korean Peninsula, supported each other's positions in certain international forums, and engaged in extensive military-to-military exchanges. However, tensions also emerged over issues including China's military modernization, its militarization of contested islands in the South China Sea, and American concerns regarding human rights. The Obama administration's pivot to Asia strategy, announced in 2011, marked a subtle but significant shift in U.S. policy toward China. While officially framed as a rebalancing toward the Asia-Pacific region to promote American economic and security interests, many Chinese analysts interpreted it as a deliberate strategy of containment designed to constrain China's rising influence. During this period, multiple friction points emerged. Disputes escalated over China's increasingly assertive posture in the South China Sea, where Beijing began an extensive program of island construction and military fortification. American freedom of navigation operations, in which U.S. naval vessels transited waters claimed by China, created recurring incidents and heightened tensions. Additionally, American and allied governments raised concerns about Chinese espionage activities, intellectual property theft, and the forced transfer of technology to Chinese companies operating within China. The election of Donald Trump in November 2016 portended a dramatic shift in the U.S. approach to China. Trump, who had frequently criticized what he characterized as unfair Chinese trade practices and intellectual property theft, initiated a more confrontational strategy. While President Trump took over the American presidency, during 2017 to 2021, his approach to China differed markedly from previous administrations. Rather than accepting the premise of engagement and integration, Trump framed U.S. China relations explicitly in terms of economic competition and strategic rivalry. In March 2018, the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on steel imports and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports, citing national security concerns. Though theoretically applied to all countries, the tariffs disproportionately affected China. In April 2018, following investigations into alleged Chinese intellectual property theft, the administration announced tariffs on approximately $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. China responded with retaliatory tariffs on American products, particularly agricultural goods such as soybeans, beef, and pork, products that would directly impact Trump's base of support in rural states. The conflict escalated throughout 2018 and 2019. By the end of Trump's first term, tariffs on Chinese goods had reached as high as 25% on many product categories, and Chinese retaliatory tariffs on American goods were similarly substantial. The Trump administration also took aggressive action on the technology front, moving to restrict Chinese access to advanced semiconductors and imposing sanctions on Chinese technology companies, including Huawei, which the U.S. government identified as a national security threat due to alleged ties to the Chinese military. These measures were intended to slow China's technological advancement and protect American technological leadership. However, the Trump administration also signed a Phase 1 trade agreement with China in January 2020, in which China committed to increasing purchases of American goods by $200 billion over 2 years in return for reductions in some tariffs. China failed to meet these purchase commitments, acquiring only 58% of the agreed-upon amount. When President Joe Biden assumed office in January 2021, many observers expected a shift away from Trump's tariff-focused approach. However, while the Biden administration pursued a different rhetorical framework, emphasizing alliance building with American partners rather than unilateral tariff threats, it maintained, and in some respects intensified, competitive policies toward China. The Biden administration upheld most Trump-era tariffs on Chinese goods. It also expanded export controls on advanced semiconductor technology, restricting Chinese access to the most sophisticated chips essential for artificial intelligence development. The administration pursued what was termed a policy of small yard, high fence, maintaining close technological integration with trusted allies while erecting substantial barriers to Chinese access to advanced American technologies. During this period, China's military posture toward Taiwan became increasingly assertive. The People's Liberation Army conducted more frequent and larger-scale military exercises around Taiwan, and Chinese military aircraft crossed the Taiwan Strait with greater frequency. These activities reflected Beijing's frustration with what it perceived as growing international support for Taiwan and the island's democratic government. The South China Sea remained a source of ongoing tension, with Chinese and Philippine vessels engaging in repeated confrontations involving water cannons and near collisions. The United States continued freedom of navigation operations in the disputed waters. The second Trump administration, which began in January 2025, brought renewed escalation in trade tensions with China. In April 2025, the Trump administration announced what it termed Liberation Day tariffs, imposing a comprehensive 10% tariff on all imports, with additional tariffs on Chinese goods. Over the course of several weeks, tariff rates escalated dramatically through tit-for-tat increases. By April 11, 2025, U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods had reached 145%, while Chinese retaliatory tariffs on American goods reached 125%, in addition to sector-specific tariffs on agricultural products and energy. This escalation threatened global supply chains, roiled financial markets, and imposed substantial costs on American consumers and businesses. American importers reported dramatic cost increases, and economic analyses warned of significant impacts on GDP growth and employment. The escalation proved economically unsustainable for both sides. Chinese factories faced closure due to lack of export markets, and unemployment rose. American importers and consumers faced surging prices. Global markets experienced significant volatility. Agricultural interests in the United States, particularly soybean farmers facing Chinese retaliation, lobbied the Trump administration for relief. On May 12, 2025, following back-channel negotiations in Geneva, both countries reached a 90-day ceasefire agreement. Under the deal, the U.S. reduced tariffs on Chinese goods from 145% to 30%, while China reduced tariffs on U.S. products from 125% to 10%. China also agreed to suspend export controls on rare earth minerals, critical materials essential for electronics, defense systems, and renewable energy, which had emerged as a significant lever in Chinese hands during negotiations. The truce held through late 2025 and into 2026, though underlying trade tensions remained. Most of Trump's tariffs remained in place, at levels significantly higher than pre-2018 baseline rates. The 30% tariff on Chinese goods represented the highest baseline tariff on China since the 1930s Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, widely credited with exacerbating the Great Depression. While considering the recent events, the fragile trade truce culminated in a historic state visit to China by President Trump in mid-May 2026, the first visit by a sitting U.S. president to China since Biden took office in 2021. The two-day summit between President Trump and President Xi Jinping on May 14th to 15, 2026 represented the highest-level engagement between the two powers in years. The summit addressed multiple contentious issues. The two presidents discussed the ongoing trade relationship and the framework for a more comprehensive trade agreement. According to an official White House fact sheet released following the summit, the two countries established two new institutions, a U.S. China Board of Trade and a U.S. China Board of Investment, to manage bilateral economic relations on an ongoing basis. Commercially, the summit produced several agreements. China committed to purchasing 200 Boeing aircraft for Chinese airlines, a significant order for the American aircraft manufacturer that represents China's first major commitment to purchase American commercial aircraft since 2017. China further agreed to purchase at least $17 billion per year of U.S. agricultural products in 2026, 2027, and 2028, in addition to commitments made in October 2025. The summit also addressed supply chain vulnerabilities. China agreed to address U.S. concerns regarding supplies of rare earth minerals and critical elements including yttrium, scandium, neodymium, and indium, which are essential for advanced electronics, military systems, and renewable energy infrastructure. Both sides agreed to work toward resolving supply chain bottlenecks that had developed during the trade war, underscoring that the economic stakes of the relationship extend far beyond tariffs alone. The Taiwan question, the historical dispute over the political status of the island, emerged as the most contentious issue in the Trump-Xi summit. According to Chinese state media accounts, President Xi warned President Trump that mishandling the Taiwan question could jeopardize the entire U.S.-China relationship, stating that Taiwan independence and cross-strait peace are as irreconcilable as fire and water. Xi further cautioned that if the Taiwan issue is not handled properly, the two countries will have clashes and even conflicts, placing the entire relationship in great jeopardy. These were notably strong statements from the Chinese president, reflecting the depth of Chinese concern about Taiwan's political trajectory and international status. The Trump administration attempted to reassure Beijing regarding its intentions toward Taiwan while continuing to support the island's defense capabilities. Trump stated his respect for Xi and indicated a willingness to maintain the long-standing framework of strategic ambiguity, the deliberate lack of clarity regarding the precise nature of American security commitments to Taiwan. This ambiguity has historically served to deter both Chinese military aggression and Taiwanese independence movements, though it also generates uncertainty on both sides. Since assuming office in 2024, Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te has adopted a more assertive stance regarding Taiwan's status as a separate political entity, which has alarmed Beijing. Chinese military exercises around Taiwan have increased in frequency and scale, with the People's Liberation Army conducting multiple large-scale exercises simulating scenarios, including air and naval blockades of the island. These military activities represent both a show of force and a response to what Beijing views as provocative statements and actions by Taiwan's government. A significant development during the May 2026 summit was the Trump administration's reported approval of NVIDIA's application to export its H200 chips, among the most advanced artificial intelligence processors available, to major Chinese companies, subject to regulatory conditions. This was presented as a modest easing of the technology restrictions that had characterized the Biden administration's approach, although the scope and permanence of any such easing would depend on the final regulatory framework. The technology competition between the U.S. and China extends beyond semiconductors to artificial intelligence development more broadly. Both countries recognize that artificial intelligence represents perhaps the most strategically important technology of the coming decades, with implications for economic productivity, military capabilities, scientific advancement, and societal transformation. The U.S. maintains a technological lead in large language models and advanced AI systems. But China has made substantial progress and is investing heavily in AI development to narrow the gap. The U.S. export controls on advanced semiconductors and AI chips represent an attempt to slow Chinese technological advancement by restricting access to essential components. However, these restrictions create incentives for China to develop domestic alternatives, and Chinese technology companies have made progress in developing semiconductors and AI systems that do not depend on American components. The long-term effectiveness of a U.S. technology containment strategy remains uncertain. Beyond Taiwan, trade, and technology, the Trump-Xi summit also addressed regional security issues, including the situation on the Korean Peninsula, where North Korea continues to develop nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. Both the U.S. and China expressed interest in the denuclearization of North Korea, though they have historically differed on the methods and timeline for achieving this objective. The summit also discussed the Middle East, including the Iran conflict that had delayed Trump's planned visit to China by more than a month. The U.S. sought Chinese cooperation on maritime security issues, particularly regarding the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of global oil supplies transit. China, with substantial interests in Middle Eastern energy and trade, shares American concerns regarding the stability of this critical waterway. The Trump delegation to China included more than a dozen American business leaders, including Apple CEO Tim Cook, Tesla founder Elon Musk, and NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang. These executives participated in a meeting with Chinese Premier Li Qiang, signaling the Trump administration's emphasis on commercial cooperation alongside geopolitical competition. American business sentiment regarding U.S.-China relations has shifted modestly in 2026. According to the American Chamber of Commerce survey released in January 2026, 79% of surveyed companies held a neutral or positive outlook for U.S.-China relations, a 30 percentage point improvement from the previous year, reflecting the easing of trade tensions and the prospect of more stable relations following the May summit. However, American companies continue to face substantial challenges operating in China. Trade tensions have prompted significant restructuring of supply chains, with companies including Apple relocating manufacturing operations to Vietnam and India to reduce tariff exposure. Tariffs, even at the reduced levels following the May 2026 summit, remain substantially higher than pre-2018 baseline rates and continue to incentivize supply chain reconfiguration. U.S.-China relations in 2026 remain characterized by fundamental structural tensions that the May summit and trade agreements have not resolved. The two countries occupy incompatible strategic positions. The United States views itself as the defending power seeking to maintain its technological and military predominance in a rules-based international order, while China views itself as a rising power seeking recognition as an equal and the ability to develop its economy and technology without external constraints. This competition manifests across multiple dimensions: economic competition in trade and investment, technological rivalry in semiconductors and artificial intelligence, military competition in the Indo-Pacific, and ideological differences regarding governance models and human rights standards. These competitions are not necessarily destined to escalate into direct conflict, but they create recurring flashpoints and tensions. The Taiwan question remains the most volatile issue in the relationship. China's assertion that Taiwan represents an internal matter and its refusal to renounce force represent the most significant risk factor for military escalation. Conversely, the American commitment to Taiwan security, implicit in the Taiwan Relations Act and explicit in security assistance, creates the potential for direct U.S.-China military confrontation. The May 2026 summit produced no new framework for managing the Taiwan question. Both sides reiterated their historical positions. China continues to insist that Taiwan is an integral part of Chinese territory, while the United States maintains its commitment to Taiwan's defense and the status quo of de facto independence. The reliance on strategic ambiguity to manage this issue remains fragile, vulnerable to miscalculation or abrupt shifts in political leadership. Despite substantial trade tensions, the two economies remain deeply interdependent. American consumers continue to purchase hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods annually, and American companies maintain substantial operations and supply chains in China. Similarly, Chinese companies depend on access to American technology and markets. The trade war has prompted diversification of supply chains, with multinational corporations expanding operations in Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and other countries to reduce dependence on China. However, complete decoupling of the two economies remains impractical and economically costly. The question is not whether the U.S. and China will separate, but how they will manage the coexistence of economic interdependence and strategic competition, a situation without historical precedent. Expert opinion regarding the future trajectory of U.S. China relations remains divided. The size survey of experts conducted in late 2025 found that approximately one-third of experts predicted the relationship would become more cooperative in 2026. Another one-third predicted increasing antagonism, and the remaining experts anticipated a continuation of the status quo. The success of the May 2026 summit in stabilizing the relationship is likely to be temporary unless deeper structural issues are addressed. The trade deficit between the two countries, concerns regarding intellectual property protection, technology transfer disputes, and military competition in the Indo-Pacific remain fundamentally unresolved. The strategic ambiguity and tactical accommodations evident in the May summit may delay further escalation, but they do not address the underlying sources of tension. The trajectory of U.S.-China relations has implications far beyond the bilateral relationship. American alliances in Asia, including with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines, depend in part on American credibility as a security partner capable of countering Chinese power. Conversely, China's relationships with neighboring countries and developing nations worldwide are influenced by whether Beijing is perceived as a stable, rising power or an increasingly assertive military and economic threat. Global economic growth, the stability of supply chains, the pace of technological innovation, and the likelihood of military conflict in Asia all depend partly on how effectively the United States and China manage their relationship. The May 2026 summit represents a modest step toward stabilization, but the underlying strategic competition between the world's two largest economies remains the defining feature of 21st century international relations. The coming months and years will test whether the Trump administration's approach of linking trade negotiations to geopolitical accommodation can produce a sustainable framework for U.S.-China coexistence. The answers to questions about Taiwan, technology competition, and rare earth supplies will likely shape not only bilateral relations, but the broader international order for decades to come.